Before we begin the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us where you watched it in the comments. The Arizona desert stretched wide and silent, flat as bone under the noonday glare. Nothing moved except a few thin dust devils and a column of smoke curling from a cowboy camp beside a half-dry riverbed. The air shimmered. The smell of coffee and scorched bacon clung to the wind. Ayoka crouched among the mesquite trees, her breath shallow, eyes fixed on the group of men by the fire. She had been watching them for 2 days, strangers in dusty coats, worn hats pulled low, rifles within reach. She had been told since childhood that men like them took Apache women, burned villages, and killed anyone who resisted. Every story she'd ever heard had ended in blood. Now, hunger pressed harder than fear. Her ribs ached with emptiness. Her lips were split from days without clean water. The smell of cooked beans from their fire turned her stomach in slow, painful twists. She hated herself for wanting it, for wanting anything that came from their hands. Her eyes settled on one man, sitting a little apart from the others. He was older than the rest, mid-30s maybe, quiet, broad-shouldered, his hat shadowing half his face. He moved slow, deliberate, checking the cinch of his horse, stirring the fire, saying little. The others joked, swore, and spat tobacco into the sand. He didn't join them. When one of the younger cowboys cursed at a burned biscuit, the quiet one didn't even look up. His name was Elias Ward. He had been riding the cattle trail south for nearly a month, hired by a rancher out of Bisbee to escort a small herd through Apache country toward Yuma. The job wasn't for money alone. He needed distance, and the trail offered plenty of that. He had once worked as a lawman in Prescott, left after a shooting that killed a man who shouldn't have died. Since then, he'd kept moving, always west, as if the horizon might forgive him if he stayed ahead of it. Ayoka didn't know his story. All she saw was a man who didn't talk much and didn't laugh when the others did. That made him unpredictable, maybe dangerous, maybe not. She tightened her grip on the edge of her blanket and stayed still as Elias stood and looked toward the trees. His movements were steady, not searching exactly, but aware, the kind of man who noticed what others didn't. The wind shifted, carrying her scent, and she froze. His eyes caught a flicker of movement, the faintest shift of shadow between the branches. He reached for something beside him. She tensed, ready to run, but instead of a rifle, he picked up a piece of bread. Slowly, he walked to a flat rock at the edge of the firelight, set the bread down, and turned away. No words, no gestures, just left it there and went back to the fire. Ayoka stared at it for a long time, heart pounding. Her mind told her it was a trick, that men like him baited traps this way. But her stomach trembled with hunger, so sharp it hurt to breathe. The men talked and laughed. The sound carried through the brush. She waited until their voices drifted lower, until the fire burned to quiet red coals. Then she crawled forward, snatched the bread, and vanished back into the dark. The taste of it nearly made her cry. It was hard old trail bread, dry as sand. But it was food, and it was the first she'd had in 2 days. Elias noticed the missing bread the next morning. He didn't say anything about it. When one of the men accused coyotes, he just nodded and poured more coffee. That evening, when they camped again, he left another piece on the same rock. He told himself it was nothing, a small kindness, maybe to a hungry traveler, maybe to a ghost. He didn't care which. But when he saw the faintest print of a small bare foot in the dust near the stone, he felt something twist deep in his chest, something he hadn't felt in a long time. On the 4th night, when the fire burned low and the others were asleep, he caught another glimpse of her, a figure barely more than a shape, wrapped in tattered buckskin, eyes reflecting the fire like an animal's. She looked ready to run at the first sound. He didn't move, didn't speak, just watched her take the food again and disappear into the dark. He sat awake long after, thinking about her, about what kind of fear kept a person living like that, alone in a land full of guns and ghosts. He didn't know her name, her tribe, or her story, but he knew one thing. If the rest of the men saw her, they'd shoot first and ask later. That night, Elias decided he'd keep her secret, at least for now. He told himself it was just decency, Not guilt, not pity, just the right thing to do. But when he turned his face away from the fire and saw the faint shimmer of eyes watching from the brush, he knew there was something else behind it. Something that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with the feeling that maybe for once, someone else in this godforsaken desert was as lost as he was. And that was enough reason to stay. By the fifth day on the trail, the desert changed its shape. The wind came up from the south, bringing a thin veil of sand that moved low to the ground. The men packed earlier than usual, muttering about a coming storm. Elias stayed quiet, but his eyes kept drifting toward the line of mesquite where he knew she hid. He hadn't seen her face clearly yet, only the small movements in the brush, the faint imprint of bare feet, the shimmer of eyes that watched but never came close. Still, he felt her presence every night. Each time he set food on the flat rock, he could almost sense her waiting for him to walk away. He didn't know why he cared. Maybe because he'd spent too many nights watching people disappear. And for once, he wanted someone to stay. Ayoka had been following them from a distance, sleeping in shallow gullies, keeping the campfires in sight, but never within reach. She told herself she only stayed because of the food, but that wasn't the full truth. The quiet man, the one who left food without trying to catch her, made her curious. No white man she'd ever seen had done something like that. It didn't make sense, and it bothered her that she couldn't understand his reason. That evening, the sky darkened fast. The wind carried grit sharp enough to cut the skin. She was still too far from the riverbed when the sandstorm hit. The air turned to dust and noise. The world vanished, sky, ground, everything. She tried to crawl under her blanket, but the wind tore it from her hands. Each breath felt like swallowing glass. She stumbled forward, blind, choking, and fell. At camp, Elias saw the storm rolling in from the flats, a wall of sand taller than any tree line. He shouted for the others to tie down the horses and get under canvas. The wind hit hard, throwing grit against his neck like needles. When he reached for his saddle, he saw something through the storm. A body, small, half covered in sand, a few yards beyond the camp's edge. He didn't hesitate. He pulled his bandana over his face, ran toward it, and lifted her. She was light, too light, skin gray with dust, lips split and bleeding. He carried her to the lean-to, set her down, and covered her with his coat. The men barely noticed. They were too busy holding the tent lines and swearing at the storm. When it finally broke, the camp was half buried in sand. The air smelled like wet dust and sweat. Elias checked her pulse, faint but steady. He soaked a rag in the last of their clean water and wiped her face. She stirred, coughed, and opened her eyes. For a moment, she looked wild with panic like a cornered animal, then saw him sitting nearby. Calm, hands open, voice low. "You're safe here," he said. "Storm's over." She tried to sit up, failed, and looked around the tent. His coat was over her shoulders. She touched the fabric like it was something she didn't trust. "You thought we eat your kind?" Elias asked quietly, almost as if talking to himself. Her lips moved. She nodded once. Shame flickered across her face, not for believing the stories, but for being caught believing them. He looked at her for a long moment, then said with a small, tired grin, "We only eat at night." The corner of her mouth twitched. It wasn't quite a smile, but it broke the silence. For the next hour, neither of them spoke. He cooked a thin stew, handed her a tin cup, and stepped back to give her space. She ate slowly, glancing at him between bites, as if waiting for the trick to reveal itself. Outside, the storm had flattened the trail. The other cowboys argued about whether to move camp in the morning. Elias stayed by the fire, checking on her every so often. She was young, no more than 20. Her clothes were worn to threads, her hands raw and blistered from travel. He wondered how far she had walked alone. When she fell asleep, he sat beside the dying coals, his thoughts circling back to what she'd said or hadn't said. He had killed men before, fought in skirmishes where fear made everyone the same. But the look in her eyes, that silent, hopeless fear, made him feel like the kind of man he never wanted to become. He told himself this wasn't his problem. In the morning, she could leave if she wanted. But when he saw her shivering under his coat, he reached over, pulled the canvas tighter, and decided he'd make sure she lived through the next day. He didn't understand her, and she sure didn't trust him. But in a land where kindness could get you killed, neither of them could afford to stay alone anymore. That night, the wind died and the desert grew still again. The horses shifted quietly. The men snored. Elias sat awake, eyes fixed on the horizon, wondering how a stranger had managed to make the silence feel different. And outside the lean-to, half asleep under the canvas, Ayoka thought about the man who had saved her, not as a cowboy, not as an enemy, but as someone who hadn't turned away. For the first time since the fires that took her home, she didn't feel entirely alone. The morning after the storm was clear and windless. The air smelled of wet dust and horse sweat. Elias stood outside the lean-to, cleaning sand from his rifle. Behind him, the camp was quiet. The other men had gone upstream to check for water, leaving only the slow creak of leather and the dry rustle of the tent flap. Inside, Ayoka sat with her knees drawn close, wrapped in his coat. She hadn't run. He had half expected her to be gone when he woke, but she was still there, silent, watching him through the open flap. Her face was cleaner now, her skin sun-browned and cracked at the lips, her black hair heavy with dust. There was strength in the way she sat, cautious but not broken. Elias poured a little water from his canteen into a tin cup and handed it to her. "Drink slow," he said. She obeyed without speaking, her fingers trembling slightly as she held the cup. When she finished, he nodded toward the horizon. "You got people somewhere?" Her brow furrowed. She didn't understand. He pointed again, to the north, then to himself. "You people?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "No." Her tribe was gone, burned out by soldiers months ago, scattered into the desert or across the border. Elias didn't press her. He saw the way her shoulders tensed, the way her eyes went blank when she thought about it. He recognized that silence. He carried his own. Later that day, he gathered the horses, mended the torn canvas, and set up a smaller fire. The others hadn't returned. He could have left her. It would have been easier, but the idea didn't sit right. There was no reason strong enough to justify walking away from someone who'd already lost everything. She stayed close, but never too close. When he worked, she watched. When he ate, she waited until he looked away before touching her food. Elias spoke now, and then, short words, slow and clear. "Fire, bread, water." He pointed as he said them, watching her lips repeat the sounds. By evening, she could say a few of them back, softly testing the shape of the words. He didn't smile, but his voice eased when he answered. "Good. You learn quick." That night, they camped under a new canvas stretched low between two wagons. The storm had stripped the sky clean. The stars were sharp and cold, and the moonlight threw pale lines across the ground. Elias lay near the fire with his hat tipped low, listening to the horses snort in their sleep. He was trying not to think about the things that had brought him here. The town he left, the badge he'd thrown into a river 2 years ago, the letter from a woman in Prescott that he never opened. But the quiet left too much room for memory. When he turned his head, he saw her awake too, staring into the flames. "You can stay," he said, not sure why he said it, "till you're strong." She met his eyes for a long moment, trying to read his tone. Her English was too limited to catch everything, but she understood the offer. She nodded once, slow and careful, as if testing the truth in it. The next morning, she walked ahead of him as they moved along the dry riverbed, pointing to the ground now and then, saying a single word, "Water." Elias followed her lead, curious. She crouched and pressed her palm against a patch of darker soil, then began to dig with a flat stone. Within minutes, damp sand appeared. He knelt beside her, helped widen the hole, and soon water seeped up, muddy but drinkable. He sat back, impressed. "You found that by looking?" She smiled faintly, tapping the earth. "Listen," she said, placing her hand flat. He copied her, pressing down. The faintest vibration pulsed through the ground, the buried echo of a stream still alive beneath the dry crust. That night, she taught him other small things, how to see direction from wind patterns, how to tell snake tracks from lizard trails, how to catch moisture by tying cloth over thorn branches. In return, he showed her how to use a knife properly, how to check a horse's hoof for stones, how to read stars for distance. It wasn't friendship yet, not trust either, but there was a rhythm forming, one built from shared silence and the slow exchange of knowledge. When the other cowboys returned, they noticed her right away. The youngest, Jeb, laughed. "You pick up a stray, Ward?" he asked, smirking. Elias didn't rise to it. "She stays with me for now." "Boss ain't gonna like that," Jeb said. "Boss ain't here." Elias' tone ended the talk. The others shrugged it off. In the desert, a man's choices were his own, until they caused trouble. That evening, Ayoka kept her distance from the group, sitting by the smaller fire near Elias. The others whispered, curious but not brave enough to say more. She noticed their looks, the half-smiles and sidelong glances, and her jaw tightened. Elias saw it too. He didn't speak, but when he refilled her cup, he made sure the gesture was calm and steady. Not pity, not protection, just normal. After they ate, she reached up and touched the turquoise bead on her braid, running her thumb over it like a memory. Elias caught the motion, then turned back to the fire. He didn't ask, but he thought about it. Who had given it to her, and whether they were still alive. Before sleeping, she whispered something in Apache, a few quiet words that sounded like thanks. He didn't understand the language, but he understood the tone. He tipped his hat slightly in return. That night, as the fire sank to coals, he realized how strange the quiet had become. It wasn't the silence of grief anymore. It was something else. The kind that settled when two people stopped seeing each other as threat and started seeing each other as real. And though neither of them would say it out loud, both knew the desert had changed shape again. Not softer, not safer, but less empty than before. By the time they reached the foothills north of the Santa Cruz, the trail had narrowed to a winding path between dry arroyos. The herd had been sold off 2 towns back, and half the men had peeled away with their pay. Only Elias, Jeb, and 2 others remained, pushing west toward a supply stop called Willow Bend. The air was hotter now, the kind that baked the skin under a shirt. Each step of the horses sent up small bursts of dust that clung to their boots. Ayoka rode the spare mare, barefoot, quiet, her braid brushing the animal's shoulder. The turquoise bead caught the light every time she turned her head. She stayed near Elias, but never behind him. She refused to look like a servant or a burden. The others had mostly stopped staring, though Jeb still made comments when he thought Elias couldn't hear. Elias always did. He'd look at the boy long enough to make him fall silent again. The uneasy peace between them wasn't the kind that came from understanding. It came from fatigue. Everyone had their own reasons for being on the trail. Elias knew the others were just chasing wages and whiskey, but he had something heavier sitting under his ribs, something he didn't talk about. That night, when the fire burned low, Ayoka asked softly, "Why you here?" Her English was still rough, but she'd learned enough to build simple questions. Elias thought for a moment before answering. "Because I got nowhere else to be." She studied his face. "Family." He shook his head. "Not anymore." The pause that followed wasn't just silence. It was the kind that came when 2 people recognized the same kind of loss in each other. He poked at the fire with a stick. "I used to be a deputy up north. Small town. I thought doing the right thing meant everything would make sense." He stopped, staring into the flames. It didn't. She waited. She didn't push, but he kept going, not because he wanted to talk, but because she didn't fill the air with useless sympathy. There was a boy, drunk, scared, had a knife, but he wasn't mean. I told him to drop it. He moved wrong. I shot him. Elias' voice stayed level, but his hand tightened around the stick until the wood cracked. His father never forgave me. I couldn't forgive myself either. Ayoka nodded slowly. "You leave." "I left," he confirmed. "Figured the desert might not care who I was." She understood that kind of running. The difference was that she hadn't chosen hers. She told him, haltingly, about the winter raids, how soldiers burned her village, how she and her younger brother hid in a cave for 2 nights before the smoke cleared. When they returned, everything was gone. She never found him. She'd been walking ever since. Elias listened without interrupting. The look on his face wasn't pity. It was the recognition of something he couldn't fix but respected enough not to cheapen with words. The next day, they rode side by side through a narrow pass, the kind where sound echoes off the walls. The heat pressed close. A lone buzzard circled overhead. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. At midday, Jeb spotted a few men watching from the ridge, not soldiers, not travelers. Elias recognized the look immediately. Drifters. Raiders maybe. He didn't react, but his hand rested on the rifle tied to his saddle. The men on the ridge turned away after a minute, but he knew what it meant. They were being watched. That evening, when they made camp, he took extra care with the perimeter. Ayoka noticed. "Bad men?" she asked. "Maybe," he said. "We'll move early." As they ate, she unwrapped a small leather pouch from her belt. Old, worn, tied with sinew. Inside was a piece of bone carved into a bird. She held it between her fingers, then set it near the fire. "My mother's," she said quietly. "Before soldiers come." Elias looked at it, then at her. "You carry it everywhere." "Yes. From memory." He nodded. "I had something once. My brother's knife. Lost it in a fight outside Yuma." She tilted her head. "You find again?" "Maybe someday," he said, though he didn't believe it. For a while, neither spoke. The fire crackled. The desert hummed in the distance. Then, almost without thinking, Elias reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small object, a silver badge, dented, edges blackened by age. He turned it over in his palm, looking at it like it belonged to another life. "Kept this longer than I should have," he murmured, then tossed it into the fire. The metal hissed and glowed before sinking into the coals. Ayoka watched, silent. When he met her eyes again, she said only one thing. "Now you free." He didn't answer, but something in his face eased. A small shift, like the tension in his jaw had finally loosened. That night, the air was cool enough to sleep without sweat. Elias lay awake, staring at the stars through the flap. He thought about her. The way she spoke, the calm in her voice when she talked about death and loss, as if they were part of the land itself. She wasn't fragile. She was what survived when everything else burned away. He realized then why he hadn't let her go. Not pity, not obligation, but because she reminded him that survival didn't always mean running. Sometimes it meant staying still long enough to let something heal. At dawn, when they packed the camp, Ayoka saw him glance at the ashes of the badge. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. She picked up her mother's carved bird, tied it back to her belt, and mounted her horse beside him. They rode in silence, the rising sun behind them, the desert stretching wide and open ahead. He studied her face, young but lined with hardship. "You sure?" he asked finally. "This place is a long way from people." "That's why it's good," she said. "People are the ones who left me." The answer struck him harder than he expected. There was no bitterness in her tone, just fact. He understood it too well. Solitude, when chosen, felt cleaner than company built on fear or guilt. By midday, he agreed. "All right," he said. "Then we'll make it a place worth staying." He spent the rest of the day cutting posts from nearby juniper trees. The smell of sap filled the air as he worked. Ayoka helped however she could, sorting smaller branches for firewood, tying cords to dry meat strips, cleaning tools. Every motion she made, even simple ones, carried the quiet determination of someone rebuilding a life piece by piece. When the sun dipped lower, Elias began raising a simple frame for a cabin. Nothing fancy, just 4 walls and a roof that could withstand the wind. He built wide doorways so the chair could pass through. The hammering echoed down the basin, mixing with the song she hummed under her breath, an old Apache lullaby she remembered from her mother. That night, the skeleton of the cabin stood tall against the fading light. Elias leaned against a post, exhausted but content. "It'll hold," he said. "They still run patrols." Elias met his eyes. "We're not causing trouble." The man shrugged. "Don't have to. Trouble finds its way." By sundown, word had already spread. A cowboy sheltering an Apache woman. It was the kind of story that traveled faster than wind. When they set camp a mile outside town, Ayoka sensed his tension. She watched him check his rifle twice, tighten the horse lines, and keep his back to the fire while he ate. Bad people? She asked. Maybe, he said. The kind who look for someone to blame. She looked toward the dark horizon. You leave. Not yet. The next afternoon, 3 riders appeared on the trail. Men from another ranch, led by Pike Lathrop, a broad-shouldered man with a clean vest, silver spurs, and a voice that carried like a threat wrapped in charm. Elias knew the type instantly, the kind who never fired first but always made sure someone else did. Pike dismounted slowly, brushing dust off his coat. You're Elias Ward, right? Rode with the Bisbee herd. Elias nodded once. That's right. Well, Pike said, tipping his hat. Word in town is you're keeping company with an Apache woman. That true? Elias said nothing. Pike smiled. Don't get me wrong, friend. I'm not the law. But the 4 boys hear about this. They'll come down hard. You don't want that kind of attention. Best thing is to turn her over. Let them handle it. Safer for everyone. Ayoka stood behind Elias, her face unreadable. She didn't understand every word, but she knew what was being said. Her hand moved to the small bone carving at her belt. Not out of fear, but resolve. Elias' voice stayed calm. She's not property. She stays with me. Pike's smile faltered. That's a fool's choice. Maybe, Elias said, stepping closer, but it's mine. For a moment, no one moved. The wind rattled through dry weeds. Pike's men shifted in their saddles, waiting for a signal. Elias' hand hovered near his revolver, but he didn't draw. Neither did Pike. Instead, Pike gave a short, forced laugh. You're either braver than most or dumber than all of them. He turned to his men. Let's go. Sheriff will want to hear about this. They rode off, leaving a thin trail of dust behind them. Ayoka looked at Elias. They come back. Yeah, he said quietly. They will. That night, he built a smaller fire, keeping it low behind a stand of yucca. The horses were restless. Even the desert air felt tense. Ayoka sat across from him, wrapping her blanket tight. She wanted to ask why he risked himself for her, but the question stayed behind her teeth. She didn't want him to say it was guilt or obligation. Instead, she asked, why you no go east? Safer. Elias looked up from the fire. East is where I came from. She studied him. You not run anymore? He shook his head. No, I'm tired of running. The next morning, he took her to the creek and showed her how to clean the rifle, how to work the levers smoothly without flinching. She caught on quickly. You want me fight? She asked. I want you to know how, he said. Knowing makes fear smaller. By noon, Pike returned, just like Elias had expected. This time, he wasn't alone. 2 of the sheriff's men rode with him, along with a deputy from the fort. They stopped 20 yards from camp. Pike raised his hand in mock courtesy. Ward, he called, we're here official this time. You got a woman of hostile blood in your camp. You're ordered to surrender her for questioning. Elias stood his ground. She's done nothing wrong. The deputy spat into the dirt. That ain't my call. Ayoka stepped forward before Elias could stop her. She faced them head on, her chin high, voice steady. I'm not taken. I stay by choice. Her English was halting, but her tone was clear. Pike smirked. She talks now, does she? You teach her that. Elias didn't move. She learned it herself. The air between them hung heavy. The deputy shifted, uncertain. For a moment, it looked like guns might clear leather, but then a second rider galloped in from town, a young man with a star pinned crooked on his vest. He reined in hard, dust spraying his boots. Sheriff says stand down, he shouted. No warrant, no charge, no authority from the fort. You touch him, it's on your own head. Pike cursed under his breath, but he knew the law well enough to step back. Fine, but don't expect the town to welcome you, he said, turning his horse. You're on your own out here. When they rode off, Elias exhaled slowly. He didn't look at Ayoka, not right away. He was angry, not at Pike, but at how close it had come to ending badly. She walked to his side, her expression calm but proud. They gone, she said. For now, he answered. That night, the fire burned steady again. She sat beside him, closer than before, her shoulder almost brushing his arm. Neither of them spoke for a long time. There was nothing to explain, nothing to justify. When she finally said, you could let me go, but you don't. He looked at her for a moment, then back at the flames. Maybe because I don't want to be the kind of man who walks away anymore. She thought about that, then nodded once. Then I stay. Elias didn't smile, but the edge in his voice softened when he said, all right. The fire crackled, the night stretched wide, and for the first time since either of them could remember, the silence between them didn't feel like waiting. It felt like belonging. The next morning came with no sound but the crack of a distant hawk and the hiss of wind over sand. The campfire had burned to ash, and Elias was already awake, checking the saddle straps, his jaw tight, eyes fixed on the horizon. The attack hadn't come last night, but he knew Pike's kind. They didn't give up out of reason. They paused to gather a crowd. Ayoka stepped out from behind the wagon, the rising light washing gold across her face. She looked at him, saw the way his shoulders were squared, and understood before he spoke. They come back, she said quietly. Most likely, he replied, and this time they won't talk first. The others from the trail had already moved on days ago. It was just the two of them now. No herd, no backup, no one to argue with or explain to. Only the land, dry and open, and whatever choices they had left. Elias started to dismantle part of the wagon, pulling the boards free to use as cover. We'll set up here, he said. There's a rise behind us and brush to the sides. Good field of view. Ayoka helped without question, stacking wood, packing the supplies into a small pile. She worked fast, focused, her movements clean and efficient. He noticed how steady her hands were. No shaking, no hesitation. She'd lived through worse than this. As the sun climbed, he handed her the rifle. You remember what I showed you? She nodded, testing the lever, her finger resting along the frame. You only fire if you have to, he said. And if I tell you to run, you run. She gave him a sharp look, something almost like anger in it. I know, run again. He met her eyes, saw the determination there, and let the words stand. All right, he said softly. By noon, the air shimmered with heat. The silence felt thick, like the desert itself was waiting. Then, faintly, they heard hooves, 5 riders coming from the east, moving fast. Dust lifted behind them in thin spirals. Elias crouched by the wagon, sighting through the gap. Pike rode in front, his vest neat, his expression calm, as if this were just business. The deputy who'd warned them yesterday wasn't with him. This wasn't official. This was payback. The riders stopped 100 feet away. Pike raised a hand. You had your chance to hand her over, he called. Now it's out of my hands. Folks want things right. You make it easy, and we all walk away breathing. Elias didn't answer. His voice, when it came, was steady and low. You ever think maybe right don't come from a crowd, Pike? Pike laughed, shaking his head. You sound like a preacher. Shame preachers don't live long out here. He signaled to his men. 2 began circling to the left, another moving wide to flank. Elias didn't move. Ayoka crouched beside him, her breathing even, eyes scanning the brush. The first shot came from one of Pike's riders, a warning into the dirt. Elias fired back once, clean and measured. The man's hat flew off. He swore and retreated. Pike yelled, Hold your fire, but the tension had already broken. A second shot cracked through the dry air. It hit the wagon plank inches from Ayoka's shoulder, splintering wood. She ducked, then lifted the rifle, aimed, and fired. Her shot tore through the sleeve of the shooter's coat, missing flesh, but sending the man spinning backward off his horse. Elias turned to her. Good shot. She didn't answer, just reloaded quickly, her jaw set. Pike cursed, realizing his bluff was gone. You're digging your own graves, Ward. Elias rose, slightly behind the wagon, voice calm but sharp. Then you better dig yours too. Another shot rang out, this one from the ridge. A single bullet struck the dirt beside Pike's horse. Everyone froze. From the ridge above, 2 mounted figures appeared, soldiers from the fort. The lead man held a raised hand and shouted, Enough! It took a moment for the scene to settle. The soldiers descended the slope, their rifles angled low but ready. The older one dismounted, his uniform worn and dusty, clearly not eager for a fight. What's going on here? He demanded. Pike was quick to speak. This man's harboring a hostile. She's done nothing wrong, Elias interrupted, stepping out into plain view. The rifle lowered but still in his grip. She's free. She's with me by choice. The officer looked from Elias to Ayoka, then back to Pike. You got proof otherwise? Pike's mouth opened, then shut again. There was nothing he could say without sounding like the liar he was. The officer's tone hardened. Then this is done. You take your men and ride back to town. Anyone fires another shot, I'll drag you to Yuma myself. Pike stared at Elias, hate simmering behind the calm in his eyes. Then he turned his horse. This ain't over, he muttered. It is for me, Elias replied. When the riders disappeared over the ridge, the officer lowered his voice. You two best move on. Not everyone out here listens to orders. Elias nodded. We will. By the time the soldiers rode off, the light had started to fade. The desert turned gold, then red, then quiet again. Elias gathered their few belongings. We'll head north at dawn, he said. Ayoka was still staring in the direction Pike had gone. He come again? No, Elias said. He'll talk, but talking's all he's got left. She looked at him for a long moment, then said, You stay for me. He hesitated. What do you mean? When they come, you could go. But you stay. Elias wiped the sweat from his brow, the day's weight settling in his bones. I've walked away from too many things I should have stood for. Not this time. She nodded slowly. Then we same. That night, it didn't sleep much. The fire burned low, and they sat side by side, backs against the wagon, rifles within reach. The desert was still. No wind, no crickets, only the faint whisper of sand shifting. Elias glanced at her once. Her eyes were half closed, but she wasn't asleep. He thought about the first night he'd seen her, a shadow in the brush, terrified and starving, and how far they'd come since then. He didn't say it out loud, but he knew it. If anything came for her again, he wouldn't hesitate. When dawn broke, pale and cold, they packed what they had and rode out. The sky ahead stretched clear and endless. Behind them, the tracks in the sand would fade before noon, like they'd never been there at all. But for the first time in years, Elias didn't feel like he was running from something. He was riding toward it, and Ayoka, silent beside him, finally believed that maybe not all men who stayed close meant harm. They rode north for 3 days, following the creek that wound between low, cracked hills. The danger from Pike and his men faded behind them, but the tension didn't leave right away. Every sound still made Elias check over his shoulder. The scrape of a rock, a bird's wings, the echo of a hoof on dry stone. It wasn't until they reached the cottonwood flats that he finally let his breath ease. The land there was different, quieter, softer, the soil darker, the water still flowing just enough to coax small patches of green from the dirt. This'll do, he said, pulling the mare to a stop. Ayoka looked around. The place was simple, open, framed by trees that whispered in the wind. Here, she asked. Here, Elias repeated. He climbed down and knelt by the creek, tasting the water, then nodded. It's clean. They made camp that night under the cottonwoods. For the first time in weeks, the air smelled of life, damp bark, grass, the faint sweetness of distant sage. Ayoka knelt by the fire, spreading her blanket on the ground. Elias watched her quietly, realizing how natural it had become, the way they moved around each other without words, without planning. In the morning, he rode into town for supplies, lumber, nails, canvas, and a hand shovel. The clerk asked questions, of course. You settling? The man asked, writing slowly in his ledger. Thinking on it, Elias said. Where? North, past the bend. The clerk raised an eyebrow. That's Apache country. Elias gave a dry half-smile. So is most of the earth if you go back far enough. He left it at that. When he returned, Ayoka was gathering smooth stones from the creek. Why stones? He asked. For walls, she said. Strong when storm comes. They spent the day building, Elias cutting wood for the frame, Ayoka stacking stones and packing mud between them. She worked hard, silent, her face streaked with dust and sweat. The sun burned their necks, their hands blistered, but they didn't stop. When a structure began to take shape, 4 walls, a doorway, and a slanted roof, Elias stood back and said, Looks like a home. Ayoka tilted her head, unsure of the word. Home, he nodded. Place to stay, to belong. She thought about that for a moment, then repeated softly, home. That night, as they sat by the fire in front of the half-built cabin, Elias unfolded a small stack of papers he'd brought from town. Got something from the sheriff's office, he said. A form for land claim. Says anyone can stake a piece if it's unoccupied and worked for 6 months. She listened closely, trying to follow. He explained each part, how names went on paper, how signatures made it official. Then he stopped and frowned. You don't have a name the law would recognize. I have name, she said. I know, he said gently, but not one they'll write down. She thought for a long moment, then said, You write mine. You tell them. Ayoka Ward. He looked up surprised. Ward, you save me. You stay with me. We same now. Elias felt something stir deep in his chest, a mix of gratitude and fear. He didn't answer right away. Then, quietly, he said, If that's what you want, then that's what I'll write. He filled out the form by firelight, the sound of his pencil scratching against paper. When it was done, he folded it carefully and tucked it into his coat. Days passed. They built the roof, sealed the gaps, planted a small patch of beans near the creek. The work was slow but honest. The scars on Elias's hands started to heal. Ayoka's laughter, rare but real, began to return. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they didn't. It didn't matter. The silence between them had stopped being a wall. It had become a language. One evening, as the sky turned copper, Ayoka took a small leather pouch from her belt, the same one that held her mother's carved bird. She opened it and pulled out the turquoise bead she'd worn since the day he met her. Without saying a word, she held it out to him. He shook his head. That's yours. She stepped closer, took his hand, and pressed it into his palm. Now yours too, she said. Elias didn't argue. He slipped it into his shirt pocket and nodded once, the kind of quiet agreement that meant more than any promise. Later that night, a soft rain began to fall. The drops tapped gently on the roof of their new home. Inside, the fire glowed low, and the air carried the warm scent of wet earth. Ayoka sat cross-legged by the flames, mending a tear in her blanket with a bone needle. Elias sat nearby, cleaning his revolver, the habit of an old life he hadn't yet unlearned. After a while, she looked up. You know, go, she asked. He glanced at her. Go where? Other towns. You always move. He considered the question, the weight of it. Then he said no, not anymore. She smiled faintly, then returned to her sewing. Outside, the rain grew steady, running down the sides of their new walls, soaking into the earth they'd worked together. The fire crackled, steady and sure, and for the first time in a long while, both of them felt what they hadn't dared to name: peace. In that quiet, Elias realized something simple, the kind of truth men often chase their whole lives without finding. He wasn't a lawman anymore, or a drifter, or a man trying to make up for what he'd done. He was just a man with a roof, a woman beside him, and a piece of land that didn't ask for anything but care. And for Ayoka, who'd spent too long believing the world only took, this was enough proof that sometimes, even after the fire and the fear, something good could still grow in the desert. By early spring, the land around the cottonwoods had changed. What used to be dry, colorless dirt now carried small patches of green, stubborn shoots of bean vines climbing along thin poles Ayoka had carved from willow. The air smelled cleaner after every rain, and even the wind that swept through the valley no longer felt hostile. It moved like something alive, something that had accepted them. Elias sat on the porch they'd built together, sanding the edge of a wooden chair. His hands were rough and scarred, but the motion was steady, practiced, patient. He hadn't touched a gun in weeks. The rifle still leaned by the door, but it gathered dust now. That, more than anything, told him life had shifted. Inside the cabin, Ayoka stirred a pot of beans over the small stone hearth. The smell drifted out into the cool morning. She hummed something under her breath, a soft tune from her childhood, low and rhythmic, the kind meant to call calm into a house. It was the first time Elias had ever heard her sing. When she stepped out with 2 tin plates, she caught him smiling faintly. What? She asked. Didn't think you'd ever make this place sound like home, he said. She looked around at the small cabin, the smoke curling from the chimney, the line of laundry moving in the breeze, the small corral they'd built for the mare. It is home, she answered simply. They ate quietly, listening to the morning sounds, the creek flowing, birds chirping from the cottonwoods. For a moment, it felt like nothing outside this valley existed. After breakfast, Elias walked to the shed and pulled out a small envelope, dusted from travel. "Letter came from town," he said, holding it up. "Sheriff sent word back." Ayoka wiped her hands on her skirt and stepped closer. "Good." He opened the paper slowly, reading. The sheriff's handwriting was rough, but clear enough. Land claim approved. Registry complete. Property: Elias Ward and Ayoka Ward. He read it twice before looking up at her. "It's official," he said. "It's ours." For a moment, she didn't move. Then she smiled. A real smile this time, the kind that carried both relief and disbelief. "Paper make us safe?" she asked. "Safe enough," Elias said. "Safer than before." She took the letter from his hand, studying the printed marks she couldn't yet read, then folded it carefully and placed it in her pouch beside her mother's carving. "Then it stay with me," she said. As days passed, the rhythm of their lives settled. Elias worked the field. Ayoka tended the creek and traded herbs with passing travelers. They spoke more now, short sentences, slow English mixed with Apache words. Their conversations were practical, but under them ran an easy warmth that needed no explanation. Sometimes, at dusk, they sat on the porch and watched the horizon turn red. He would roll a cigarette, she'd rest her chin on her knees, and they'd watch the world fade without saying a word. But even peace has echoes of the past. One afternoon, a shadow of it rode up their trail. Elias spotted the rider from a distance, one man on a roan horse, coming slow. The hat, the way he sat in the saddle. He recognized Pike Lathrop before he was close enough to speak. Ayoka came to the door, her expression calm but alert. "That man?" she asked. "Yeah," Elias said quietly. "That man." When Pike finally stopped a few yards away, he looked different, thinner, older, the arrogance stripped down to something closer to exhaustion. He dismounted, holding his hat in both hands. "Didn't come for a fight," he said. "Then talk standing where you are," Elias replied. Pike nodded. "I heard you staked this land. Figured you'd either be dead or halfway to Mexico by now. Guess I was wrong." "You were," Elias said flatly. Pike looked past him at Ayoka, who stood silent at the door, her gaze steady. "Word is the fort's pulling out soon. Territory's changing. Folks might finally start seeing things different." Elias narrowed his eyes. "You come to tell me that?" Pike sighed. "No, I came to say I was wrong. About her. About you. You didn't owe me that fight back then. You stood your ground. Most men wouldn't have." He put his hat back on, looking awkward, unsteady. "That's all I came for." Elias didn't answer. He just nodded once, not in forgiveness, but in acknowledgement. That was enough. Pike turned his horse and rode away, the sound of hooves fading until the desert swallowed it. When he was gone, Ayoka exhaled slowly. "He no come again," she said. "No," Elias agreed. "He won't." That night, they sat outside again, the moon high and clear. The air was cool, and the land felt at peace. Ayoka leaned against his shoulder, and he covered her hand with his, rough over soft, old scar over new life. "You still think desert empty?" she asked quietly. He smiled faintly. "Not anymore." She looked toward the dark horizon. "Then we stay." He nodded. "We stay." Weeks passed. The cabin filled with new sounds. The creak of the porch and wind, the soft splash of water in the pail she carried, the hum of life returning to a place that once felt cursed by silence. When spring turned to summer, the beans ripened, and they hung strips of meat to dry under the porch roof. Sometimes travelers passed by, soldiers, ranchers, settlers, all surprised to see a white man and an Apache woman working the same land. Some stared. A few nodded. Most rode on without words. Elias didn't care anymore. Let them see. One morning, they rode out together at dawn, following the creek bed where the ground shimmered in early light. Ayoka's braid caught the wind. The turquoise bead glowed against her dark hair. Elias rode beside her, his hat low, the lines on his face softer than they'd ever been. When the trail bent west, she looked back once at their cabin, small, square, perfect in its simplicity, and smiled. "This place, ours forever?" she asked. As long as we keep it that way, Elias said. They rode on, side by side, the sun breaking over the desert. The land ahead was endless, quiet, and alive, a place that no longer feared them, and they no longer feared it. For the first time in their lives, both knew what it meant to stay. Not because they had nowhere else to go, but because they finally had somewhere worth staying for. And when the wind moved through the cottonwoods behind them, it carried no warning, no ghosts, only peace and the sound of two souls who had finally found their way home.